Monster House presents.
It's actually quite unlike anything we've ever seen before.
A giant, hairy creature, part ape, part man.
In Loch Ness, a 24-mile-long bottomless lake in the Highlands of Scotland. It's a creature known as the Loch Ness Monster.
Monster Talk.
Welcome to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
Spooky greetings. It's finally October again, and we're kicking off the month where everyone else finally remembers the gothic vibe that Monster Talkers hold dear all year. And it's time to start season 4 with a friendly little chat with Karen and her husband Matt Baxter about our theme for October, vampires. We'll be talking about a Croatian vampire whose name may be Arnold Paole, or maybe it's Poole, who was hinted at in our previous episode with Professor Nick Groom. I was amused to notice in preparing for this episode that Arnold was a haiduk, a word I previously only recognized from the lyrics of the viral song Dragonstad Dente, a.k.a. the Numa Numa song, when they have this line,
Hallo? Salut? Sunt eu un haiduk?
Which means, hello, I am an outlaw. So we'll be getting into his outlaw story and how it ties in with our modern understanding of vampires. But this also got me thinking about stuff that I read as a monster kid growing up, like the idea that hypertrichosis, or the hair-growing medical condition behind famous sideshow figures like Julia Pastrana or Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy, might be behind werewolf stories. And then there's that whole idea that vampires might be explained by the disease porphyria. But where did that idea come from? I mean, I knew about those two diseases as well as neurofibromatosis, which is the condition that John Merrick, the Elephant Man, may have had, all from reading books about monsters and weird medical conditions growing up. But it appears that the first paper connecting these diseases to monster lore was a journal paper called On Porphyria and the Etiology of Werewolves by Lee Illes in 1964. And then, in 1985, Canadian scientist David Dolphin suggested that porphyria might be behind vampire legends. Porphyria is a horrific disease, and we don't need to invoke this rare genetic condition to explain vampires. More accurately, the condition can resemble some of the worst effects of what movie vampires go through when they're exposed to sunlight. It's a fascinating set of symptoms that do overlap with some vampire lore, but it's such a rare genetic condition and so appallingly debilitating that it's a bit absurd to imagine anyone suffering from this condition lived long enough to become the basis of a vampire legend. Yet, invoking the word porphyria outside of a medical milieu is kind of a shibboleth that you're plugged into 80s vampire books. Anyway, we've got several vampire episodes in a row for you. And now, let's get on to the
Monster Talk.
Okay, first of all, let's say welcome back to another Monster Talk. Tonight we have Matt Baxter joining us. Hey, Matt. And
hey.
We're going to be continuing because, by the time this episode comes out, we will have officially entered into two things. First of all, the spooky season of October. And second of all, our 4th season.
Ooh.
Considering that our first season was more than 200 episodes. That's such a weirdo.
Wow, we're speeding things up nowadays, hey?
Yeah, so we're getting like 52, 53 episodes a season, so that's pretty cool. And
fantastic.
So this will be season 4, episode 1. And we just got through talking to Professor Nick Groom about vampires. But even though
Make it sound like a chore, we just got through it.
No, I'm just saying it was like it's fresh. No, it was absolutely delightful. And I felt like we could have talked to him for several more hours and still just spent the whole time learning new things. And that's funny because I think all of us have been lifelong fans of vampires, except for I told you about my recent discovery that my wife has, that I guess, I don't know how else to put it. She's vampire racist. That's
Well, she is more of a fan of werewolves, correct?
I think she likes werewolves, yes. In fact, she likes to say that the first movie we saw together was An American Werewolf in London. So
she likes to say, is that...
Well, it's one of those things that it's an important part of our marriage lore. It's also grossly inaccurate because it's the second movie we watched together, but that's another story. She
Oh, well, we won't get into that. That would truly be monstrous.
I don't want to open those old wounds again.
Marital rows, yeah. But I guess why are we talking about vampires again since we spoke to Nick Groom? Well, I've got a vampire-related project that's coming up, and this is Halloween season 2. And as you say, most people love vampires. So
many people. That's right. Yeah. But not my wife. Yeah. So I guess I could say whatever because she won't listen to this because it's got vampires in the title. So.
Well, but then she'll listen to this to see if you're talking shit about her.
She doesn't even know I have a podcast.
It's kind of like that with my family too. Even though Matt sometimes appears on here, doesn't make any difference.
I thought this was a joke on Blake that we really don't have.
Shh.
Sorry.
I've just been talking into a bucket since 2009. What?
Yeah, we have spoken about vampires. Back to the topic. I think we did a live episode on vampires once before, speaking about our favorite vampires.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it all comes back to Usborne guides, because that's where I first heard about vampires. I mean, it was probably an osmosis thing, hearing about vampire movies, Dracula, and that was one of my first encounters with vampires, was in one of these supernatural guides on vampires, werewolves, and demons. And it's interesting because, Blake, you and I kind of came together because of stories like Jeff the Talking Mongoose and Lord Dufferin's ghost story. And I think that this was a connection that Matt and I made, that we both came across this particular tale, the story of a fellow called, we both thought it was Arnold Paole, and we've recently been hearing more and more people pronounce his name as Arnold Paole.
Ah, interesting.
Correct, Matt?
Yeah.
So
well, all vampires are pale.
Pale, yeah. Yep.
At least down here in the South they are.
Jokes about this, and yeah. But Matt, how did you hear about Arnold Paole?
I don't think I had like one particular place. It was probably in a book that I might have checked out from the school library or something, but it wasn't from the Usborne books, like you guys. You guys had all the cool stuff, but I remember reading about it and thinking this is the coolest thing ever. It's like this was a real vampire. And it's interesting because I had written a piece of Highlander fan fiction.
As we all do.
Yeah. It's pretty average. I don't even know why I'm talking about it. But yeah, I thought, okay, this is great. You got these immortals and everything. So what would happen if somebody died and came back to life and thought that they were actually a vampire and not just like one of these immortals, because why would they know? And what horrible things would they, get up to not knowing any better? And so, yeah, I wrote this whole story, Duncan MacLeod, when he has his little flashbacks, he flashed back to that time when he and Arnold were on that hay rack or the hay trailer, and he fell off and became an immortal, and everyone thought he was a vampire, and it was a really fun little story. And how he had to now in modern day had to go track him down because he's still alive, and help Elvis. This other newbie adjust to life as an immortal. So it was just
maybe
kind
Elvis is a vampire.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any Elvis is still alive stories in a long time, but those were all up in the 80s. I mean, they were all over the place.
Yeah. Oh, I remember that as a kid because his middle name was misspelt on his tomb and all kinds of folklore about that.
Yeah, I still always will love the Tommy Lee Jones comment in Men in Black that he didn't die, he just went home.
Yeah.
Well, so with the story of Arnold Paole, Blake, are you familiar with it?
No, please tell me about it.
Okay, well, I was going to read from the book, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, from the Usborne book?
Pages long.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I've got it here, accompanied by all of the fantastic illustrations.
I know the illustrations are awesome. It's so funny because I think I've definitively come down that my introduction to Jeff had to be from the Usborne books, right? So it's just funny because they're these small little children's books, yet they manage to cram so much legendary course material there. I mean, it's
classic stuff.
And sure, you can learn more, but I mean, golly, they get the basics really good. They do a great job. So, or as my wife would say, they get the basics very well. What?
So yeah, reading from this story, so the story of Arnold Paole. In 1729, a young soldier from Serbia named Arnold Paole was sent to a remote and haunted part of Greece. One night he was viciously attacked by a vampire. He knew that unless he acted quickly, he would die and become a vampire himself. The only solution was for Arnold to find his attacker's grave, eat some earth from it, and smear his body with the vampire's blood. Although he carried out this remedy, Arnold was so afraid that he left the army and returned to his home. Arnold settled on his small farm in the village of, and I think it's Medvedja. It's got a little kind of diacritic on the D, and I've asked a Serbian friend if that's a pronunciation. He said, yeah, so we'll go with that.
Yeah.
If any of our Serbian listeners want to correct us, you know how to contact us.
Yeah, please do, and they will. And he seemed to be quite unharmed when he returned. However, during the harvest, he fell from a hay cart and died soon thereafter. He was buried in the local churchyard, but he did not rest there in peace. Within a month, Arnold was seen wandering the village at night. People who saw his spirit became very ill, and 4 died within a few days. Panic spread, and it was decided Arnold's body must be dug up and checked for any signs of vampirism. This gruesome task was carried out one grey winter morning, about 10 weeks after Arnold's funeral. The gravedigger dug up the coffin, watched by officials from the capital city and army doctors as well as local dignitaries. When the coffin was opened, what it revealed made everyone certain that they were dealing with a vampire. Arnold had moved to one side of the coffin. His hair and nails had grown, and his mouth was red with fresh blood. He looked like a living man. Arnold's corpse had to be dealt with in one of the traditional ways for ending vampirism before his soul could rest quietly. The villagers scattered garlic over Arnold's body and said prayers for his spirit. A stake of white-horn wood was driven into his heart with one blow. Warm crimson blood gushed from the wound as if Arnold was still alive, although he'd been buried over 2 months. The corpse writhed in agony and let out a dreadful yell. The 4 victims of Arnold's nighttime attacks were dug up in case they had become vampires too. The reports of this epidemic of the undead in Medvedja do not mention the condition of these corpses. However, it seems that they were vampires as they were dealt with in the same way as Arnold had been, stabbed by white thorn stakes and beheaded with a spade. Finally, all the vampires were thrown into a roaring bonfire and burned in the fierce flames. Fire was supposed to be the ultimate weapon for destroying vampires. A pile of smouldering ashes is impossible to revive. Once deprived of an earthly home, the vampire's soul was forced to go to the spirit world. Although all the vampires had been staked, burned, and reburied, within 6 years a new epidemic broke out in the village. Once again, people were taken ill and became pale and weak as if from a loss of blood. They died suddenly, just like Arnold's victims. The villagers now knew how to deal with the danger, and another party of investigators arrived from Belgrade. They examined every suspicious grave and found many corpses in a vampiric state. These included children and even small babies as well as adults. All were full of fresh blood, so they were dealt with in the usual way. The ashes were then thrown into a river to carry them away. People suspected the new epidemic had been caused by eating meat from animals once attacked by Arnold Paole. So that's the story, and I think it really encompasses a lot of that kind of Balkan lore. Prior to Dracula, following tales of Vlad the Impaler, but it really does cover a lot of the kind of peasant lore as opposed to the vampires of fiction.
Well, I think it's also interesting that it also implies that there were vampire hunters. They called them investigators there, but
yes, that's true, and I do wonder about that because I'm hearing a lot about even museums finding vampire hunter kits, and certainly a lot of YouTube videos, and I'm just a little bit suspicious about them. Do you know anything about vampire hunters, Blake, and hunting kits?
So spoilers, it appears that most of the kits, well, as far as I know, all the kits that have been identified appear to be late Victorian recreations of what they think they should have looked like, which is disappointing because they look friggin' cool. I know Joe Nickel has a really nice one, and I've seen a lot of them in museums. And it's just kind of sad because they look like authentically like they would be something. Well, they look like movie props. They look exactly like you would expect a vampire hunter to have, but they're mostly in response to sort of the rise of vampires in fiction, and as we kind of discussed in our previous episode in the late 1800s.
Right. Yeah, it's not like we'd have too much left over from the medieval era anyway. But
well, true enough. But it's interesting because I think in our interview with Professor Groom, he talked about the Habsburg dynasty and that they had been responsible for doing investigations into Eastern European vampires. And this is one of the two cases that was kind of famous. I guess the other was Peter Blagojevich. I'm sure I'm slaughtering that name in the same way that he slaughtered his victims.
Yes. Blagojevich.
Yeah. But it's that that whole idea.
I think he predates Arnold Paole.
He does. But my understanding is that they're both Habsburg related cases. That, in other words, that there were official royal investigations, which kind of ties up all these sort of. I guess a lot of people who read modern understanding of these vampire cases read them as sort of primitive understanding of forensics, like the first time people really start to pay attention to what happens post-mortem to people. So there's a really interesting sort of science tie-in there because we know way more now about what happens when people die, and how that...
Yeah, but at the same time, we've got things like chupacabra sightings and cattle mutilations, and
I'm not saying we're smarter.
But yeah, that's definitely true. Just to get back to the vampire.
Sure. Yeah.
Quickly, Matt made a good observation. You were watching a video on one of them, and you were looking at the little containers that they had of arsenic and little cute bottles full of poisons and things.
The person that was kind of showing this kit, which did look pretty authentic and everything in terms of aged, they said that this was the kind of thing that was marketed to travelers that were going to strange lands. And that seems really like a great demographic to buy a vampire hunter kit. That seems like the perfect person because they don't know what they're coming into in this new country. And if you've got somebody there going, oh, no, trust this, you're going to need this. That seems like a great market right there. Still not authentic, but, an authentic fraud from the get-go. Now the thing is I noticed that the crosses that were also stakes, wooden stakes at the end, were kind of held in the box with these clips that you had to kind of undo and really clumsy to get them out. And I'm thinking, okay, if a vampire's like, coming at you, that's probably not the best way to have those in there. And then they had these candle holders and stuff, that you had to, there was some assembly required. And I'm thinking that's another great thing to have is the vampires upon you. And then they showed this little packet of matches that you could strike a match, and because fire is not the vampire's friend was how it was stated. And I thought, oh Lord, the only thing the vampire could do in its defense is to go.
Yeah.
Maybe they can't.
So yeah, just a lot of it just seemed absurd from the get-go, but they are the coolest looking kits. I would love to have one of those kits, but I know that they are all fraud.
Well, I think the lesson there is that LARPing did not begin in the 20th century. I mean, I think people were sort of role-playing way back in the day. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they were out meadow LARPing.
Yeah. So, I don't know where we want to go to from here, because I just put in some notes for kind of general discussion, but we kind of started with the story, and
I
like to take it anywhere we want to take it.
Well, one of the ways I wanted
some ideas.
I was going to say I wanted to talk about the
flattening.
There is that whole flattening thing, exactly. Talking about how. I think it's a very European thing to make everything that drinks blood a vampire, and there's another thing. In fact, we'll probably dig into that more because I'm very interested in talking about some of the other so-called vampires. Maybe we should let's try to make an episode this month, on Asian vampiric creatures. I'm not willing to call them vampires, but they certainly they sort of fall in that category, and that includes the Filipino monsters where the head comes off and searches for blood, or I think that's Malaysian. Hey, why not both? The Penanggal is the Malaysian version of this monster, and the Manananggal is the Filipino version of this monster, and we'll probably be talking more about them in future episodes. And then the Chinese hopping vampires. There's all kinds of varieties.
Well, I wonder if we can find an expert in that time to talk about that, because that does make me think of earlier stories. And in talking with Professor Groom, we were talking predominantly about vampires kind of 18th century and beyond. And yet there are a lot of claims that vampires are universals and that they have existed across time and space. And from all the reading and research that Matt and I have been doing, we hear about ancient vampires and always have that link, as you say, Blake, to blood, that connection to blood somehow, either drinking blood or being bloodthirsty or something like that. But a lot of the ancient vampires don't necessarily seem to be the kind of what's the word I'm looking for? But just the canonical vampires. Classic vampires.
I've seen people describe Lamia and Strigas. Like these are blood-sucking creatures, but they're not vampires. They're demons or something else. And that's what I'm thinking of too, because Matt and I have been talking about Lilith and Lamash too. Yeah.
Going back to Jewish mythology and Mesopotamian demons as well, and yet they're. A lot of sources will say, well, they're the earliest vampires because they would drink the blood of children or attack pregnant women and children. So maybe we need to have a content note in here as well. But even goddesses like Sekhmet from ancient Egypt, and it's claimed that she's one of the earliest references to vampirism, that she was the blood-drinking goddess of war. So I don't know, where do you draw the line in talking about vampires?
I don't know where to draw the line, but we should probably see if Joe Laycock would come and talk with us, because he's done a lot of research about vampire culture, and I think a lot of this erupts after the creation of Vampire the Masquerade, the game from White Wolf.
Awesome game.
And it sort of kicked off a really, well, it's interesting. I don't know how many, a big chunk of it is people identifying with vampire culture and wanting to LARP it full time and like becoming full time vampires and saying that that's their that's their thing. And some of them literally drink blood. And then there are people who would call themselves psychic vampires who and I think
Colin.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Yeah.
Colin from
Colin Robinson.
Colin Robinson.
Yeah, I was thinking
What We Do in the Shadows.
Oh, I see. From What We Do in the Shadows, the TV show, right? And not the movie, right? And also there are people who, they self-identify that way, and they take it quite seriously. So I think Laycock's done a lot of work on that, and I'm curious about what of that predates the game. I mean, and because obviously vampires are obviously far older than the game, but the game.
Well, when did the game come out? Do you have any idea?
Had to be late 80s, right?
I thought it was 90s.
Nope, 91. I game with people who worked for White Wolf. And my brother-in-law used to work for White Wolf. So, I've got lots of the gaming side I know real well. but it crept out into the real world. I mean, people actively participated in vampire culture in a way that is, I'd call it LARPing, but they seem to really identify as though it were really happening. So I don't, and when you're really drinking blood, what are you doing?
Well, I think we should also mention Brian Sharpless's book, The Monsters on the Couch.
Oh, yeah.
And he talks about what was it called, Matt Renfield syndrome?
Renfield syndrome, yes.
Yeah.
Why, he's mad. Look at his eyes. Why, the man's gone crazy.
But apparently, as part of that, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, people will have a bloodlust or want to actually drink blood and physically go in search of blood, and that it can be even a kind of sexual paraphilia.
Ooh.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's hot.
And
yeah,
that
it's a real thing.
This game. Is it you too may have this syndrome?
So, but it's not only these things that are interesting. I want to talk about how vampires were terribly feared throughout that period when they were just folklore, and then when it became fiction with Bram Stoker, people were terrified. Through the years, the Hammer films, they were all horror movies. They were terrifying, and then we reached a point where suddenly vampires are not so terrifying anymore. And with me, I mean, I, as a little kid, loved Dracula. He was the coolest thing in the world. And you had like on the Munsters. Mm-hmm. And then you had the Count from Sesame Street. And it's like we were kind of, the little kids were now getting exposure to this vampire thing without it being terrifying anymore. And so then suddenly, what happens? Boom, Bob's your uncle. There you sparkle. It just went through this really weird process where suddenly vampires aren't scary anymore, but they're still incredibly beloved. But now we identify with them. We want to be them. And it's no longer this thing that we're terrified of. We don't keep garlic in the house because we're trying to keep vampires away.
Romantic, and that is a question I wanted to ask Professor Groom. We just kind of ran out of time, but I wanted to say it's entirely speculative. But where will vampires go to from here? Can we kind of make some forecasts into where the direction that the folklore might go and the literature might go?
Yeah, I wouldn't even want to speculate except to say that since they deal with life force, and there's probably a lot of stuff that could be said about sort of economic sort of versions where people, suck out the life force from a culture or suck out the economic resources from a culture. So that, I mean, they're a parasite. I mean, ultimately.
Yeah. Well, and Professor Groom was talking about that as well, about, I guess, vampires as leeches, and throughout time how political figures have been branded vampires. And I can certainly see that as a metaphor.
Yeah, and I mean they've been a metaphor for contagion and all kinds of interesting. And another thing I'd like to talk about over the course of this month is I'm sure you grew up on the same monster books I did, which they always talk about natural explanations. Now, as vampires representing contagion, they get tied in with things like cholera and tuberculosis.
Rabies, yeah.
But how many times have you heard of porphyria as being an explanation? I mean,
too many.
Porphyria for vampires and hypertrichosis for werewolves. I mean, every kid's book has that. And it doesn't really address the sort of the fact that this is folklore and monsters and they don't need to have a medical basis to spread. There's so many, you don't really need to have spiders erupting from boils for the folklore of that story to work. Folklore does not need a real world basis, I guess is my point. So.
Yeah, well, I think that there are no two vampires are the same. I think that it could possibly account for some cases, maybe, but I think that you just have so many things at play, so many potential illnesses or just folklore or stories, and you really have to look at each individual case to be able to ascertain what's going on. But certainly that's one of those kind of chestnuts, that condition keeps coming up.
Yeah, and skeptics, we love a natural science explanation. Anything but letting vampires be real. Come on.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's just not one size fits all.
That's
vampires.
right. That's right.
Well, Blake, did you ever have a favorite vampire?
A favorite vampire?
Yeah, he does, right? And people should go back and listen to that episode.
Oh my God, do I have a favorite vampire?
You don't remember?
No, I've forgotten.
Highgate.
Oh my God, yes, no, I totally love that story. Oh my God, yes, the Highgate vampire is absolutely a favorite. Yeah. Oh my God, yes, no, that is fantastic. I really.
We should do an episode on that topic because that is.
Yeah, I think the litigious side of it slowly dying off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably safe to discuss at this point. Yeah.
Safer. Yeah. But what about you, Matt? Because mine is I've spoken about
Arnold.
Number, but Arnold. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was a great introduction into real world vampires for me. But that is a tough one. I mean, I did really like Gary Oldman as Dracula. At the time it was a lot of fun seeing it portrayed more as Vlad the Impaler being Dracula. That was a very interesting take on it. I love the Count from Sesame Street, especially Blake, have you seen when he's censored?
No.
You just introduced me to that. And
no. Are they just beeping out what he's talking about? Is that what they're doing?
Well, he sings a song about how much he likes to count. And every time he says the word count, they bleep it.
You know that I am called the Count because I really love to. Sometimes I sit and all day, but sometimes I get carried away.
Yeah.
Is there another word that
spiders on the wall?
Yeah.
When I'm alone, I count myself.
Nice. That's really funny.
It is counting hilarious.
Well,
it really is.
I want to say that as much as I love that story with the Highgate vampire, the Gorbals vampire story, where the 1950s story of the kids in Scotland hunting a vampire in the graveyard, Ginny with the Iron Teeth, is now becoming one of my favorite vampire stories. And I know we've talked about it before. Oh. But I
thought you said Goebbels vampire.
So Gorbals. Yeah. But just the idea of a bunch of kids in Scotland roaming a real graveyard with weapons trying to fight a vampire while their parents don't know what the hell's going on. That is just, it's cool. It could make it's a true story. It could make such a great movie. Yeah, it would be so good. It would be so good. So yeah, that's it's increasingly haunting my imagination.
Ooh,
Well-
what about Let the Right One In?
No, that's a great movie. It's a great movie.
That was a good one too.
I have not seen the American version, but I love the European version.
Yes. I
I'm
agree.
still a fan of Nosferatu. I think that's my favorite.
Which is coming out soon as a remake. That'll be very exciting.
Gosh, just thinking about, there's so many angles to this topic, and I think it'd be a good idea to bring Joe back on. And I'd really like to get into historical vampires and go back to Vlad the Impaler and Elizabeth Bathory, and we've barely touched upon them.
Yeah. That's
Oh,
right.
okay.
That's right. Well, and it's interesting because, you really have those two different kinds of vampires, the ones that look kind of like Nosferatu and the ones that look more like, Dracula.
Yes.
But then it became a thing that the older of a vampire you were and more powerful you were, the more you look like Nosferatu.
Yeah. And I think
the less human you looked.
I think that whole idea of scripted, that fiction drives folklore and folklore feeds back into fiction. Vampires are one of the key places where that happens, and werewolves, I guess, where it's the literature that really drives the imagination, which leads to the way people experience vampires and sort of play act in this space. So it's really,
so art imitating life.
Exactly. Yeah. Art imitates life, then life imitates art, and it's just a cycle. It's just a circle. It's a Ouroboros. So.
Well, then they did that great thing with Shadow of the Vampire with Willem Dafoe playing Max Schreck.
Yes.
And it just carried more of that sort of folklore and legend that there was just something wrong with Max Schreck. It's that he was somehow sort of haunted and inspired by the whole vampire thing. But that was a fun movie too.
It was a fun movie. Yep. I enjoyed seeing that one. Yep. I got to see that one in the theaters, weirdly enough. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Rare.
Well, we should probably wrap things up, I think.
Yeah, I think
and for another episode. And
absolutely. We've sort of set a template for how we're going to handle October. And this
a vampirific
exactly
month.
I'll see if I can get Joe to join us. That would be really fun, and sort of dive in on these things. I would really love to sort of if you'll pardon me for saying so, hammer down some of these topics. And so
Monster Talk.
You've been listening to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
You just heard a chat with myself, Karen, and Matt Baxter about vampires to kick off our 4th season and a spooky October vampire marathon. I mentioned some research about porphyria in the opener and have put links to the Illis paper and to a New York Times article about David Dolphin's presentation in 1985 in those show notes. Vampires are such a big category, and hopefully over the course of this month you'll learn some new factoids for your Halloween party chat. We love it when we can help make you more interesting. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Monster Talk. Our goal here is to bring you the best in monster-related content with a focus on scientific skepticism and critical thinking. If you enjoy our show and want to support our mission, start out by visiting monstertalk.org/support. That's monstertalk.org/support. There you'll find links to our Patreon page, as well as a donate button if you'd like to just make a one-time contribution. A great way to support the show is to buy books from our Amazon wish list. These are books that directly help with our monster research. We love used books very much, so don't feel compelled to buy new ones, and we're also very fond of Kindle editions because of their easily searched content. And without spending any money at all, you can support and raise the profile of the show by leaving a positive review at iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Positive reviews help keep us visible in iTunes, which is a great way to help us find new listeners. Finally, remember to share episodes you really like with your friends and family. You can help make Monster Talk the nightlight that keeps monsters away from someone you love. Monster Talk theme music is by Peach Stealing Monkeys.
One thing about living in Santa Carla I never could stomach. All the damn vampires.
This has been a Monster House presentation.